All right, so what I'd like to do is just begin, so now we're going all the way back to the 19th century, with an overview of the history that we're covering. So next week we have on some motifs in Baudelaire as our main reading, and then the third week of Baudelaire we will do the Central Park selections from the folder in the Arcades Project dedicated to Baudelaire. So, timeline, our essential timeline, which I think we've discussed before, but let's do it again. Because he uses language, Benjamin uses language that assumes historical references that might be obscure for you guys. So of course we have the American and French revolutions at the end of the 1700s. And we have, in the French Revolution, we have the First Republic, which became the First Empire. So when people refer to this as like Republic style versus Empire style, it's just the First Republic and the First Empire. So it's the period of the First French Revolution, 1789 to 1815, second defeat of Napoleon. Then we have the July Revolution and the July Monarchy, which come about in 1830. July 1830, the July Revolution that overthrows the Restoration. And so the Ancien regime before the French Revolution are the Bourbons. The Restoration are also the Bourbons. The July Revolution brings about a constitutional monarchy in France, and that is the Orleans. So it's Louis Philippe. Louis-Philippe Orleans. The significance of which is that if you know the Duke of Orleans, so he's the brother of Louis XIV, who built Versailles, who established absolutism in France, in the French monarchy. French absolutism. So Louis-Philippe Orleans is brought in as king because in 1830 with the July Revolution, with the constitutional monarchy as opposed to the Restoration monarchy, because in the French Revolution, when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were put on trial for counter-revolutionary conspiracy with the Austrian monarchy to overthrow the revolution. Of course, the entire royal family came out against this trying and execution of the Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, except the Orleans heir, who was like, yeah, they betrayed the nation, they should be put to death. So so it has a symbolic significance for them to put in a king after overthrowing the Restoration monarchy, who is, and he's referred this way, the Louis Philippe. He's the bourgeois king, he's the citizen king, he's the regicide king. Right, so we want a king, but only a king that represents our right to put the king to death. Okay, so I mentioned the American Revolution only because the American Revolution and the French Revolution are part of a longer historical process that reaches back and is relevant to this later history. the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution of the 17th century. Part of the instigation for the French Revolution is the centenary of the English Glorious Revolution. And what did the English Glorious Revolution accomplish? It accomplished a constitutional monarchy. So the English Civil War, they brought in, they had a parliamentary republic briefly under Oliver Cromwell, but then they had a restoration monarchy. They brought the restored monarchy back, and then they overthrew that restored monarchy in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, and that established a constitutional monarchy, where the monarch went from being the divine right of kings to being the highest paid employee of the state. So they wanted in France originally what the English had. They got more than that. They got more than a constitutional monarchy. They got a republic and then an empire. But in some ways, the whole sequence of the English Civil War to the Glorious Revolution is similar to the sequence from the French Revolution to the July Revolution. Meaning you can see 1830 is the ultimate resolution of the French Revolution in the way that 1688 is the ultimate resolution of the English Civil War. As bourgeois revolutions. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, bourgeois revolutions. Now the American Revolution is of course conducted under the claims of the rights of Englishmen. It's more than that, but it's the claims of the rights of Englishmen, meaning that the American colonists feel that they're being denied the rights established in the Glorious Revolution. So it's about the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution in the colonies and how they felt that their rights as English citizens under the terms of the Glorious Revolution were being violated. And so that's a large part of what motivates the American Revolution. So there's a whole revolutionary cycle that we're talking about. And it's the cycle of, again, the bourgeois revolutions. The bourgeois revolution, we can just call it simply, and it goes all the way back actually to the Italian Renaissance and the Hanseatic League, the Free City States coming out of the late medieval period, but also specifically the Dutch Revolt. The Dutch Revolt is the sort of beginning of the bourgeois revolution, because 1648 is also the Treaty of Westphalia that is settling the religious wars in Europe, and it recognizes two republics, the Swiss Republic and the Dutch Republic. And of course, those are Protestant republics established through revolution. Right, so instead of having endless religious warfare in Europe, they accept, no, this Protestant Reformation is happening, and the content of the Protestant Reformation is this bourgeois revolution. Marx has a famous phrase that the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution went from Habakkuk to Locke. Habakkuk being like an ancient Jewish prophet to Locke, John Locke, who was the thinker of the Glorious Revolution. So he is the thinker of the Glorious Revolution, and he's the one who establishes the three rights, the inalienable rights, life, liberty, and property. And he says property rights are based on the rights of labor. That property is not might makes right. It's not a matter of possession, but it's a matter of what you earn through your labor. So the reason we have a right to property is because we have the rights of labor, which give us the rights of property. So that's, in Marxist terms, the bourgeois social relations are the social relations of labor. This is what is recognized, the Protestant work ethic as a theological innovation in the Protestant Reformation, which is seen as blasphemous from the standpoint of traditional Christianity. It is. It's also seen as a reversion to Judaism. And so that's why the original bourgeois revolutions, the Dutch Revolt, and the English Civil War had a heavy Christian element to it. But by the time you get to the 1688 Glorious Revolution, already you're having a kind of more enlightenment, secular sense of society and history coming in that's replacing the kind of prophetic, religious, theological basis for the bourgeois revolution. So from Habakkuk to Locke. And what happens then by the end of the 18th century, by the end of the 1700s, is that you have a fully secular self-understanding of bourgeois society. So you have the Enlightenment, you have Rousseau, you have Kant, you have this fully secular, atheistic or deistic, kind of not traditional theological in any respect, sense of history and freedom, the philosophy of freedom in Kant and Hegel, all of that. And of course, Hegel and Kant are contemporaries of this late 18th century revolution. Okay, so coming around to it then, so we have First Republic, First Empire. The climax of the First Republic in certain respects is the Jacobin terror, the crisis that brings about the Committee for Public Safety. And then the Jacobins fall, and they're replaced by another kind of version of the Republic, which is the Directory. And then finally, the Directory is not able to resolve the political crisis, so they bring in the consulate. And that is when they bring in Napoleon as first consul in the consulate. And then that's still the Republic. And then as first consul, Napoleon eventually, as his coup, establishes the empire. Okay, so, and Napoleon was a Jacobin. Napoleon was a Jacobin. It's very important to keep in mind. Okay, so, July Revolution and monarchy, bringing us forward into 1830. From a Marxist perspective, that's the last bourgeois revolution. And literally, Marx says that the class struggle begins with the uprising of the weavers at Lyon in 1831. So the modern class struggle of the proletariat begins only after this whole revolutionary cycle has taken shape. Okay, so the 1830s, and then we're really dealing with the cycle from the 1830s to the 1840s. 1830s are the boom, and the 1840s are the bust. And therefore, the 1840s are known at the time as the Hungry 40s, because it's the first worldwide Great Depression after the Industrial Revolution. So that's the other.
In between them, yeah?
In between, what do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, this first crisis in the 40s or in the 30s/40s?
Starting, there's a boom-bust cycle, it sort of begins in the early 40s, but it really climaxes 1847.
Okay.
You know? And it has kind of ramifications throughout the world, meaning in the United States we have the 49ers, the California Gold Rush. And why did people do that? Why did they flee the East Coast to go to California to try to find gold? Because most of them died on the way to California. So they were desperate to do that because of the massive unemployment that occurred in the 1840s. We also know it from the Irish potato famine, which was not just about the potatoes. No. Right? So the Irish diaspora of the 1840s, and that's where the moniker Hungry 40s comes from. It comes from the most dramatic thing is the Irish potato famine, and then more Irish people live outside of Ireland than in Ireland, starting in the 1840s. Massive flight that takes place, and of course Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And England is the center of the Industrial Revolution, and that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about this period being the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, conventionally dated from circa 1750 to 1850. So that's the first Industrial Revolution. And the first Industrial Revolution is first the UK and then France after the Revolution, and also the Benelux countries. Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Benelux, Northwestern Europe, and also Western Germany. So Western Germany, the Rhineland, is affected by the first Industrial Revolution, and that's where Marx and Engels are from. They're from the western part of Germany that's most affected by both the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So growing up, Marx, his family sang French Revolutionary songs in the household. Engels is the child of a family that are factory owners. So they own factories in Western Germany, but then they also buy a factory in Manchester, and they send Engels to run the factory in Manchester. And when he arrives, he's so appalled by the conditions in Manchester that he writes his first book called The Condition of the Working Class in England, which Marx reads, and he's like, my bud, let's get together, we need to talk.
Amongst all these revolutions, like how does the Haitian Revolution fit in, and what's like the Marxist perspective?
Oh, the Haitian Revolution is part of the French Revolution, of course, because Haiti was French, right? It's a French plantation colony, and there's an uprising, and
Is it like considered the bourgeois revolution?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, even though it was a slave revolt? in part?
well, but that's how that is what the bourgeois revolution is. The bourgeois revolution is the end of slavery. It's the slave revolt. They used this language in the 17th and 18th centuries of we're rebelling against slavery. Right? And Adam Smith talks about the rise of bourgeois society as being the slaves run away and establish their new society, which then takes over. Because it's the serfs, right? Serf is euphemism for slave. So who are populating the free city-states of the Hanseatic League and the Italian Renaissance? Runaway serfs, and also people running away from the village in general, like the guild people getting away from the manorial estates. So it's the third estate, it's the commoners, and under the old medieval system, the commoners are slaves. That's what they are. They're slaves. They have no rights. Right? They're completely under the control of the church and the aristocracy. So the Haitian Revolution is inspired by, of course, what's going on in France, and inspired by the ideology of the French Revolution, namely the Jacobin ideology. So there's a book by Caribbean Marxist C.L.R. James called The Black Jacobins that's about this. And the Haitian Revolution, it's a little bit of a tragedy because you know the Napoleonic Wars, so the Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars. So the UK tries to, and successfully does, organize all of Europe and really the whole world against revolutionary France and helps put it down. Right, so the second defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, it's Wellington defeating Napoleon. It's the UK. It's the UK. Of course, it helps that there are a lot of Russians who can defeat Napoleon in his campaign. But what happens is all the French possessions become contested, right, by the countries that are trying to resist the French Revolution. So Napoleon ends up, you have a slave revolt in the Haitian Revolution, you have a Haitian Republic, but then Napoleon reestablishes slavery in Haiti. And the reason he does that is that there's a choice of you can either reestablish slavery and reestablish French control, otherwise Haiti's going to come under English and Spanish control. So slavery was going to be reestablished. And also in the Haitian Republic, slavery had already been kind of reestablished because they depended on the plantation economy, and the only way people will work that way is under coercion. So yeah, it's part of the whole picture of what's going on, for sure. Because of course these things are not national revolutions. They're not. From the Benjamin Marxist perspective, this is all world historical, right? The Dutch Revolt, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the American and French Revolutions. These are world events, right? These are, and literally they are part of a process that involves more than just things going on in particular countries. Okay, so where was I going with this? Okay, 1830s, 1840s, Hungry 40s, First Worldwide Great Depression, after the Industrial Revolution, or in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Marx and Engels are in their 20s, so they're impressionable but intelligent young men, and they're just like, yes, we are living at the center of history, and the end of capitalism, and communism is coming, and communism is the real movement of history, because that's what everyone in their 20s thinks. They think that the whole of world history is focused on them and what they're experiencing as young adults. No. Okay, so instead what you had was the 1848 revolution. And that's what we're really getting into. So the 1848 revolutions are the spring of the nations. The spring of the peoples. That's where we get the term the Arab Spring from. Right, so the revolutions of 1848. And throughout Europe, but we can talk about France and Germany in particular. So in Germany, Marx and Engels go back, they're in exile. As Bohemians, we'll be talking about this in the 1840s. Marx is kicked out of Germany basically, and he's in Paris. And but anyway, they go back to Germany to participate in the German Revolution of 1848-49. They're there for some of the French Revolution of 1848. The French Revolution of 1848 results in the Second Republic. Second Republic. Now I'll say something about the First Republic, Second Republic, and also the French Revolution. So the French Revolution, the tricolor flag. Okay, so the tricolor flag is the flag throughout the entire period. It's Napoleon's flag, it's the flag. Then they bring back the white flag of the Bourbon. 1830, however, July Revolution, they bring back the tricolor. So it's a constitutional monarchy, but it has the Republic flag. And then, of course, 1848, Second Republic, same tricolor flag. Although there is a move to make them adopt the red flag. Right, so there's a famous incident in which, I can't remember who it is now, refusing the red flag and maintaining the tricolor flag, right? And the tricolor flag, blue refers to liberty, white refers to equality, and red refers to fraternity. Right, so the goal of the 1848 revolution that brought about the Second Republic is the social republic, or social democracy. The social republic, social democracy, because it's in the context of this crisis of the hungry 1840s. So they had the February Revolution in 1848, and then there is what's known as the June Days of 1848, which is the massacre of the working class when they rise up. So why did the working class rise up in June of 1848? Because one of the things that they tried to implement, they had a socialist, Louis Blanc, was the Minister of Labor. They had a program that they were going to implement called the National Workshops. And that was going to be a public works program that would put the unemployed people to work to do infrastructure projects in France. They couldn't raise money on the international bond market or through taxes, and so they canceled the national workshops. The workers rise up, and then they're massacred. The general who massacres the workers in June 1848, Cavaignac, is the liberals' candidate for president in the election of December of 1848. there's another guy running for president in December of 1848, and that is Louis Bonaparte. Louis Bonaparte is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and who's a utopian socialist who was living in exile in England. He's a Saint-Simonian utopian socialist. He's elected, and this is a shock to the system. He's the president of the Second Republic. They have a liberal constitution in the Second Republic where you can only have a one-term presidency. So at the end of his presidency, he has a coup d'etat and he installs himself as emperor, establishes the Second Empire. And he does so in order to defend the revolution and promote the revolution. And in the Second Empire, so that is he has his coup d'etat, and then he has a plebiscite where he asks the people, do you approve? And the majority say yes. And then he renews the empire 10 years later, and they also say yes. And then in 1870, he launches a war against the Germans, the Franco-Prussian War, and he's defeated. And he's arrested on the battlefield. And the Germans occupy France. The Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, establishes German unification by crowning the Kaiser, Emperor of the Germans, at Versailles as a humiliation of the French. They sign terms of surrender, the French, but Paris refuses to surrender. And because Paris refuses to surrender, the Commune of Paris, the municipal government of Paris, establishes its own kind of mini-state with the participation of socialists, including anarchists, and that's the Paris Commune. That's the famous Paris Commune.
Why did we start with
Because of conflicts over Central European politics, meaning the Prussians had already had a war against Austria. There was an Austro-Prussian war that the Prussians won. There were intrigues around Italian unification that Louis Bonaparte was involved with. So there are political struggles in Europe. And yeah, he makes this error and has to fall as a result, because it is an error. I should also say he's Napoleon III. So Louis Bonaparte, and he becomes Napoleon III because Napoleon II died as a child. Napoleon III. And the term in Marxism for this phenomenon is Bonapartism. So Bonapartism is about the Second Empire, Napoleon III, Louis Bonaparte. It's not about Napoleon Bonaparte. It's not about Napoleon Bonaparte. Marx writes a book that Benjamin cites, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in 1852, and he famously says history repeats itself according to Hegel, but the first time it's a tragedy and the second time it's a farce. What that means is the first time it's a tragedy, the second time it's a comedy. So we've talked about this already, right, in terms of Aristotelian theory and Nietzsche's take on this, and also where Brecht fits in. And the comedy isn't ha-ha comedy. Comedy means a drama that's about human action, human events. It's about the social and political world, whereas tragedy is about divine intention and cosmic fate and all that kind of good stuff. I mention that also because Napoleon, I think we probably already talked about this, Napoleon, when he conquers Germany and Hegel celebrates. As a young professor, he takes his students out to drink champagne when Napoleon defeats Germany. And also he's in the town, Jena, where Napoleon marches through to Battle of Jena. And he writes famously, I saw world history on horseback. Right? That Napoleon summons Goethe, and they have a conversation about like art and politics and all this good stuff. And he asks Goethe, why do people still watch tragedies? Why do they still enjoy what he calls destiny plays? And he basically says, don't people understand that there is no destiny, there's only politics? Okay, so last week, we had the theological political fragment, the task of world politics. His method must be called nihilism. There is no destiny, there's only politics. But if there's only politics, then that means that there's no divine intention, cosmic meaning. There's just what we do, and so that brings about this kind of nihilistic kind of mindset in comparison to the verities of traditional life. I should also say that Friedrich Nietzsche was a soldier in the Franco-Prussian War, not much of a soldier. He was more of a medical orderly, and he got sick and would have to leave the military during the war. And Nietzsche, what impressed him most about the war was the Prussian triumphalism and kind of German nationalism, which he hated. It's like, okay, these Germans, they're only good for goose stepping, right? And he's like, I don't want to be a German, I want to be a good European. That's Nietzsche. And Nietzsche, I think I mentioned, was inspired by Baudelaire. I talked about this a little bit, maybe not yet. Was inspired by Baudelaire. And so Nietzsche is a forerunner of Benjamin in terms of actively trying to change German culture and self-understanding through an infusion of French thought and sensibility. And so Nietzsche is a big fan of the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the philosophes, and also French modernism as it emerged with Baudelaire. Right, so in 1848, we have the emergence of modernism, and the Baudelairean term is modernity, and we've talked about that. Right. So Baudelaire is one of the kind of central figures of this 1848 consciousness, as well as Marx. Right, so the question is, because Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto right before the revolution broke out in February of 1848. They anticipated it coming out of the crisis of the 1840s. So we have cultural and artistic modernity announced by Baudelaire, and we have political modernity announced by Marx. And modernity here means capitalism. Right, so the Industrial Revolution is what Marx called capitalism. Or the capitalist mode of production. The capitalist mode of production is the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. So you don't have capitalism until you have the industrial forces of production, industrial revolution. Before that, you have bourgeois society, bourgeois social relations, the social relations of labor, John Locke, property rights are based on labor, contradicted by the Industrial Revolution. By industrial production, the industrial forces of production, that's capitalism. And so modernity is capitalism. It's not, we use these terms very differently. Modernity can mean the Renaissance. No. Okay. Baudelaire, no. It's about the peculiarities of the 19th century. So something had changed in this interval between the American and French revolutions all the way up to 1830 and the revolution of 1848, which failed, which was a repetition of 1789, tragedy, but failed, farce. Comedy. Napoleon, tragic world historic figure. Louis Bonaparte, farcical, comedic, political figure. Bonapartism. So what Marx derived from Bonapartism from the experience of Bonapartism was his concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So basically, he decided that, okay, in the modern revolution, as opposed to the French Revolution and the American Revolution, the modern revolution in capitalism will either result in the dictatorship of the proletariat or the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And what he meant by that was something very peculiar, Bonapartism. Bonapartism was not really a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, it was a dictatorship of the state that rises above society and replaces the bourgeoisie. So what Marx wrote was, the old ruling class can no longer rule as before, and the proletariat cannot yet take power. And so between the dissolution of the hegemony of the bourgeoisie through civil society, you need this Bonapartist state to manage capitalism until the proletariat is strong enough to take power itself. So in 1848, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto said, the communists do not form a party of their own. They rather form the left wing of the Democratic Party, small d, in the Democratic Revolution, and they promote the interests of the working class in the Democratic Revolution. After the experience of 1848, Marx and Engels decide actually the workers do need a party of their own, separate from the Democrats, and aiming at taking power themselves in the dictatorship of the proletariat, rather than just pushing democracy in the direction of communism. So you need the dictatorship of the proletariat because capitalism requires this state intervention. It can't happen just through civil society. And so the state intervention is either going to take the form of serving the interests of capital, or it's going to be the transition out of capitalism into socialism. And Louis Bonaparte, as a utopian socialist, when he has full power in the Second Empire, his cabinet is full of utopian socialists, and they start implementing like the rebuilding of Paris and the modernization of France more generally. And they try to implement what's called the Credit Mobilier, which is like a kind of, they democratize access to like credit and finance, where they try to establish this kind of popular kind of banking to open capital up to like lower class people. It turns into a total corrupt thing, but anyway, that's predictable. And really, the Second Empire is what Benjamin calls this conspiratorial, paranoid world where you don't know who's working for whom. You don't know who's like a revolutionary versus a state actor. And it's because Louis Bonaparte himself had been a kind of conspiratorial socialist and then became the state. And so he brought part of that bohemian political conspiracy mentality into the state itself, and then utilized it to maintain state power. Right. I will also say that other figures of 1848, like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who's mentioned, he's an acquaintance of both Marx and Baudelaire. He's the one who established anarchism, who declared like he's not a Democrat, he's an anarchist. He's not for the rule of the people, he's for the rule of no one. But then he is kind of cold to the 1848 revolution, and he's the most prominent socialist in the world at that time, Proudhon. And Marx's first writings are a critique of Proudhon. So his first big book is called The Poverty of Philosophy. It's a critique of Proudhon in 1847. Proudhon is sort of neutral to the revolution of 1848 at first because he thinks, okay, I don't really care about the state and who runs the state. I'm trying to do this other thing, anarchism. But then he's elected to the National Assembly in the Second Republic, and he ultimately becomes a supporter of Louis Bonaparte because Louis Bonaparte positions himself as being a champion of the working class and of the peasantry against the capitalists. Or the liberals. The liberals. Right? Does it sound familiar? Doesn't sound Donald Trump, no. But it is fascism. It It is fascism. Trump is not fascist. So calm down, Trump. I know you think you're living through world history. Not as much as you might think. So, why is Benjamin doing this Arcades project at all? And why is he looking at Baudelaire? He's looking at the 19th century precedent for the 20th century. So he's looking at what happened when the revolution fails in the 19th century. It produces this Second Empire, modernist, Bonapartist state world. And what happens in the 20th century after World War I and the revolutions fail. Fascism. Fascism emerges directly out of World War I. Benito Mussolini was a Marxist. Benito Mussolini was a Marxist. He was one of the leaders of the Italian Socialist Party. He was a major Marxist. He knew Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin very well. They were colleagues in the Second International. And he gets disenchanted with Marxism during World War I, and he invents a new ideology, fascism, because he considers Marxism to be too bourgeois, too conservative, too reformist, and so you need a new radical ideology to be revolutionary, where Marxism had failed to be sufficiently revolutionary. So he invents fascism. And of course, he inspires Adolf Hitler. And you get this kind of very confused situation in the 1920s and 30s of the disintegration of culture and art as it had developed in the preceding period, namely the period of the Second Industrial Revolution. Which is the period leading up to World War I after the Franco-Prussian War. And it's also the period of Marxism. So the Second Industrial Revolution is the period of Marxism as a mass movement. Marx and Engels were not leaders of any kind of mass movement in their lifetime. Only towards the end did Engels find himself, 10 years after Marx's death, involved in a mass Marxist movement. Prior to that, they are important figures, but also kind of isolated figures in the larger socialist movement. They're the party of two. Marx and Engels, they're the party of two, and then the party of two becomes a mass ideological movement in the era of the Second Industrial Revolution. Prior to World War I, with major parties in Germany, Italy, the United States, France also, although France's party is less Marxist. It's a little bit more heterodox, but it's still pretty Marxist. The countries of the Second Industrial Revolution, so Germany, Japan, the United States, Italy, Russia, are the parties of the countries of the Second Industrial Revolution. They're also the most Marxist and the socialist parties in this period before World War I. But nonetheless, the revolution that came out of World War I only succeeded in Russia and then didn't really succeed because you can't have a 95% peasant country turn to socialism. That's just not possible. So Marxists thought. Of course, there were other socialists, the Narodniks, who thought that you could have peasant socialism. So Tolstoyan socialists thought that you could have peasant socialism because the peasants are already socialists, because they live communally and blah, blah, blah. No. And we get a lot of that today, too. People think, like, tribal people are already socialist. Peasant villages are already socialist. They're not. They're just ripe for capitalist exploitation. So, Benjamin, he traveled to Moscow in the late 1920s and was very disenchanted by what he saw in the Soviet Union. He had his Soviet girlfriend that he dedicated one-way street to because she broke his heart. But he left his wife for this woman and then she left him. So So don't leave your wife. Because she'll dump you. That's the lesson of the story. Don't leave your husband. Because he'll dump you. Wherever you leave your husband, he'll dump you. No, Benjamin had a little bit of drama in his life. He did. He had some drama. Okay, so
Let me
yes.
ask you a question.
Go ahead.
So, you said that basically Bonapartism, like I know this word made was fascist, yeah?
I had fascistic elements to it.
Fascistic, what elements were fascistic? Just
In Benjamin's view, it's the conspiratorial, paranoid universe, right?
Uh-huh.
It's this weird world where the state is like a criminal state, right? Where basically the state has so much power that it's sort of infiltrates the revolutionary movement, is in collusion with organized crime, is sort of, you know, very corrupt and doing things like both officially and unofficially. The thing with like the 20th century idea of totalitarianism that's really bad, which by the way, Hannah Arendt's not really guilty of this. She understood this, but other kind of more popular understandings. When people think totalitarianism, they think like a monolithic state that controls everything. No, a totalitarian state is a highly corrupt criminal state where the black market is like really important, and where basically it's just sort of extra legal violence, and you know, so it has a sort of surface level kind of image of political control, but really it's much more chaotic, and really it's corrupt. Like, and that's what you saw in the Second Empire. So the way Marx put it about the Paris Commune, he said the Paris Commune made Paris belong to the workers of the world, where the Second Empire had made France the property of world capitalism through this kind of carnival of corruption.
So for Benjamin, the Second Empire was fascist?
It was fascistic. The reason I say this is that he's motivated by the experience of the 20s and 30s to write the Arcades Project. Meaning he sees the aftermath of the failed revolution of the 20th century following the pattern, the same pattern as what followed from the failed revolution in the 19th century. So he's seeing the 20th century anticipated by the 19th century. And by the way, he's not alone in this. So Marxists of the time called fascism Bonapartism. Now, also interestingly, Trotsky called Stalinism Bonapartism as well. Right, so in other words, Bonapartism was the universal, and by the way, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, was elected, he was condemned by the socialists and communists at the time as being a Bonapartist. Which he was. Of course he was. But the point is that from the Marxist perspective, the capitalist state per se is Bonapartist.
So if Louis Bonaparte was at least like in name a socialist utopian, in Marx's account, what was the failure of that fruition? Was it just like he was disingenuous in those beliefs, or was there some failure in like,
No, the working
criminal
class.
state?
No, the working class. So the idea is that the working class had failed to do what it needed to do, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, which would not have just been like a worker in charge or something. Like the dictatorship of the proletariat idea, according to Marxism, is the social and political hegemony of the working class. So he thought that, again, the phrase is Bonapartism is what results from the bourgeoisie no longer able to rule in the old way through civil society, and the proletariat not yet able to rule. And so instead you get state rule. Right? Because the liberal democratic view is that the state is subordinate to society. Right? The American and French revolutions, the whole idea is that the state is subordinate to society. That the state should be a minimal state, the law should be minimal. You know, what you get in the 19th century, however, with capitalism, you get the metastasizing of the state. You get the state per se. So if you guys have read your Foucault, then you know police and prisons are inventions of the 19th century. They're inventions of the 19th century. They're industrial era inventions. They don't exist in the early American Republic or in the French Revolution. No. The police and prisons, and where are they kind of, police especially, where did the police happen first? In England. It's Sir Robert Peel. The Peel reforms, he establishes the Metropolitan Police of London. And it's to deal with the proletariat, right? So the state is there to deal with what capitalism does to bourgeois society, which is it proletarianizes it. It also lumpenizes it. So this is the other famous term, the lumpen proletariat. So this is Marx and Engels' term of abuse for the workers who support Bonapartism. Right, so the workers who support Bonapartism are not really like authentic proletarians, because if they were, they'd be fighting for socialism. Instead, they're lumpen proletarians who are just part of this atomized mass that politically supports Bonapartism. So famously, in 1848, when Louis Bonaparte was elected, where did most of his votes numerically come from? The peasantry. And so Marx famously described the peasantry as a sack of potatoes in the 18th year of Louis Bonaparte. Because he said they can't really be a class subjectively, they can only be a class objectively, meaning they all have the same condition, and so they just add up like potatoes in a sack. They don't form a class in itself and for itself that can take power, right? And so the peasantry are just part of this kind of mob that can elect Louis Bonaparte. And the workers, insofar as they're also like that, they are lumpen, the lumpen proletariat. I mentioned the Social Republic, the Social Revolution, the Social Republic. So the idea in 1848 that we need more than a political revolution, we need a social revolution. We need more than a republic, we need a social republic. That's because it's dealing with the social question. So in the 1830s and 40s, there emerged this idea of the social question. So what was the social question? It was the proletariat, meaning what Engels wrote about in the condition of the working class in England. Meaning this newly impoverished, like very degraded class of people, mass class of people, that didn't exist before. It did not exist before. It did not exist. So there's a new poverty that comes with the Industrial Revolution that completely violates the ideals of bourgeois society and in a sense shouldn't exist. And so then, of course, social reformers are like, we have to deal with the social question, meaning what about these people who are thrown out of work by industry and reduced to a state of a kind of industrial reserve army is what Marx calls it. So you have mass unemployment, which then breeds exploitation. Because people are so desperate, they're willing to work for very little, and that this is part of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution kind of feeds on itself. It produces impoverishment of the working class, which then it takes advantage of. Because people are so desperate, they're willing to work for nothing.
Yeah, going back to the proletariat, like what would be like an example of it today? Like a factory worker voting for Trump instead of like being.
To Marx's view, sure. It would be right. It would be the kind of
it's like a trader proletariat.
Right.
Okay.
Right. In other words, the people who are, yeah. So it's a term that he doesn't invent this language either. So what he does is a lot of this language, the proletariat. I don't know if we've talked about this yet. So the term proletariat comes from ancient Rome. There are the proletari in Rome, and they're the Roman citizens who don't own any property. So they are tribally Roman, so they have rights as citizens because it's a tribal republic. But they don't have any property, and so they have to be given a special curia in the voting to be able to vote even though they don't have property. So they're the proletari. And that term in Latin means those who breed. In other words, their contribution to Rome is not through like property, but through offspring. In other words, what they're good for is producing more Roman people. And so basically, Marx and other socialists adopt this term proletariat to refer to the working class in the industrial era, because all they really do is produce offspring. And Thomas Malthus, if you know about Malthusianism, Thomas Malthus, so he's a British political economist who looks at the emergence of the proletariat and starts thinking about like population and population dynamics, and he naturalizes it to say that throughout all of history, prosperity is followed by an overpopulation crisis. So that basically throughout all of history, when there's prosperity, then people have more babies, but then there are too many mouths to feed, and so you have poverty. And so that's why we get Malthusianism, the idea of overpopulation. Marx interprets it as it's only overpopulation as regards capitalism itself. In other words, the dynamics of overpopulation are actually the key phenomenon of capitalism. Meaning, if you want to know when capitalism starts, it starts in the 19th century when you have the emergence of the proletariat and you have a population problem. Meaning, too many people and not enough jobs. And that's the permanent condition of capitalism. But the Industrial Revolution undermines the social rights of labor, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I'll also point out that the reason that the American revolutionaries revised the Lockean life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is that they say, well, property is not a right, it's only a means to an end, and the end is the pursuit of happiness. And in the future, we'll probably find a better way than property rights to ensure that. So they didn't want to say that it is property that's an inalienable right. They just said it's the pursuit of happiness, and property is just a means to that end. Unfortunately, later in the industrial era, the Supreme Court reinterpreted the pursuit of happiness to mean property rights. But yeah, everyone has a right to pursue happiness, but that just means property rights.
I have a question. This might be like a simplistic way of putting this, but a bag of potatoes versus like the class like in itself.
And becoming for itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Is this kind of like say like the whole does not add up to more than the sum of its parts?
It is a way of thinking about that way. That's right. It's the whole that is not more than the sum of its parts. This is the Rousseauian general will idea.
Okay.
Right, which is that society, bourgeois society, is understood as more than the sum of its parts, as adding up to more than just the self-interest of the people in it. That people's interactions, social cooperation through labor produces more than just the realization of everyone's self-interest. It transforms self-interest into public interest, and therefore exceeds self-interest. Whereas the condition of the people who are desperately trying to hold on in the face of capitalism is that they're reduced just to self-interest, right? And what's undermined is the ability to participate in the general interest or the general will, because the general will is alienated in the form of capital. That's why we get capitalism as an idea. Is that bourgeois society is replaced by capital. Capital is alienated, the alienated social relations of bourgeois society. That's what capital is, and that dominates society, capitalism. And Bonapartism is the expression of the political dimension of that alienation. Meaning, what he says about Louis Bonaparte is that Louis Bonaparte represents everyone, and he represents no one. So he claims to, and in a certain sense appears to, represent everyone in society. He rises above the class differences and represents the whole society, but in fact he only represents himself and his cronies. Right? But that's not Louis Bonaparte's fault. That has more to do with the actual situation of capitalism that renders the bourgeois democratic republic alienated. And so you get the state rising above, what he says, the state rises above society in order to dominate it. So like capital dominating bourgeois society, the state also is the political form in which that takes place. And then the state serves the interests not of the people, but of capital, including against the interests of individual capitalists. So in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx wrote, when Bonaparte's coup happened, he had to suppress the liberals. So what he did was, Louis Bonaparte, when he had his coup d'etat, he sent his people out to distribute rifles to the workers and said, go shoot the bourgeoisie. And so Marx wrote, bourgeois fanatics for law and order are shot down on their balconies in the name of law and order. Right, so that's what it looks like. And also, we should understand that fascism, and including Nazism, so Benito Mussolini was a socialist, he was a Marxist who invented fascism, and the Nazis, that's the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. They were ostensibly anti-capitalist. Now, why were they not really anti-capitalist? Because, again, the Marxist view, like a Benjamin or Brecht or anybody at that time, they would have been like, well, of course, the Nazis are not really anti-capitalist because they're not mobilizing the working class to take power in society. And so they will inevitably, their anti-capitalism will only go so far, and ultimately they'll have to make a corrupt bargain with the bourgeoisie. But, nonetheless, that will involve suppressing some part of the bourgeoisie. Like, it will involve, like, picking and choosing which capitalists are acceptable to the regime and which are not. And the ones who are not will be ruthlessly dispensed with. As easily as a poor person is dispensed with. Dispense with, the wealth will not protect you because the state has the power. So again, in the older bourgeois society, wealth could protect you. In the modern society, no, wealth doesn't protect you. It just exposes you. Right, so that's the modern world. It's the modern world. That's what we're talking about, the modern world. Everything that we take for granted. And also the fact that the police are workers who are basically hired by the state to manage the other workers. Those are the police are. Before the modern police, what did you have? You had the aristocracy. And you had like the bourgeois magistrates, and you had citizens arrests. That's how people were arrested for breaking the law before the police. The citizens were just arrested and bring them before the judge and say, this person committed this crime. There wasn't a professional police force. And by the way, professional police force that remains the same despite who's elected. So it doesn't matter who's elected. You have a permanent repressive apparatus that remains the same. Right. The special bodies of armed men is what Marx called the state, and nowadays we call it the deep state. That begins at that time. And by the way, that term, the deep state, even though in the United States it's used by the right, you know where that term comes from? It comes from the Turkish left to describe that no matter who's elected, this is still the same state in charge. And so it's a term invented by the Turkish left to describe their situation of, they had dictatorship and then they had democracy, and it didn't matter because it's still the same people who are running the state. Right? The politicians change, but the state remains the same. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this is just a bit of an aside, but you mentioned how like the prison system didn't arrive till capitalism. I was just curious.
1800s, yeah.
What system preceded it? Or like what
Capital
arise
punishment.
out of-
In other words, people were killed. On the first day of class, we had the song of Louis Gondorat, who's like, a poor boy steals an egg and he's hung for it.
Yeah.
So basically, either law wasn't really enforced very much, or was enforced sort of by just the people enforced it themselves, or everything was capital punishment. So the only people who were imprisoned were political prisoners. So aristocrats could be imprisoned, or priests could be imprisoned, but That's because they basically were political hostages. Otherwise, everyone was just looking up. Right, so modern mass incarceration did not exist. It just did not exist. Because firstly, the law it wasn't exercised the same way the state didn't exist. So, people settled their disputes within civil society. Or the state didn't care. Like, the state didn't care if peasants killed each other. Like murder? No. They cared if someone said something blasphemous, then they cared. But did they care? No, they didn't care. Right? The state didn't involve itself in, like, the violence or crimes of the people. Nobody really cared. Right? So, I mean, they don't care now either. However, they have to pretend to care, and then they use that as whatever. The prison industrial complex. They enforce the law only insofar as it keeps the prison system going. Anyway, that's the world. That's the world, yes. That is our world. No, I'm emphasizing all this because there's so much about life in capitalism that we take for granted. That is not natural. It's very new. Meaning, in the grand scheme of human history, things that are only 200 years old are not very old. These things were all invented in the 19th century. They're invented in capitalism, and therefore they're temporary, hopefully? Or are we going to live like this forever? Well, we're not really going to live like this forever. Who knows? We'll be replaced by something worse, better, who knows?
You're permanently.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, that's not meant to live forever, but that's different. That's because they expected more prosperity and capital flow. In other words, you tear down a building, you build a new building. Like, instead of trying to squeeze like every little drop of money out of like a falling apart building, which is where we're all looking at. But anyway, yeah, the monuments of the bourgeoisie instantly become ruins. I don't know if we've encountered that phrase yet. We haven't. That's in the Arcades Project. That's in more reading that we'll be doing. Okay, so Baudelaire. Ooh. All right, so Baudelaire. Beyond good and evil. That's a Nietzsche phrase, beyond good and evil. Modernity is beyond good and evil. Because we don't have canvas. Maybe we do have canvas. Still down? All right. I feel like I was doing my fancy footwork dance. Because I was also hoping, because I downloaded a lot, but I didn't download everything that we need. Oh, sorry. Hold on one second. I need our Baudelaire readings. Which is from the Art and Theory book. Why is this not? Two kilobytes now. Okay, so how do I do this? One second. We have a couple of Baudelaires to read. One of which I can pull up now, which is this works. I hope everything is available on the internet. It is, it isn't. They promise and they betray the promise.
You're looking for the art and theory book?
Hey, I got
Oh,
it.
I got it.
Yeah, because I was getting, like, the one that I tried to download before class was actually the 1648 to 1816, because it was like mislabeled or something. So, sorry about that. Okay, so, Baudelaire. Oh, modernity, modern conditions. Oh, just for kicks, I'll mention something, which is Richard Wagner is a Proudhonian socialist. He participates in the Revolution of 1848. He's inspired by Proudhon and participates in the Revolution of 1848. I should also say, Frankfurt School. So where was the center of the German Revolution in 1848? Frankfurt. That's where the National Assembly was. Where is my Baudelaire?
That's right there, 489.
They had it out of order. Oh no, that's the painting
No,
of
they're
modern
all
life.
together, aren't they?
He's got the Queen of the Faculties. He's
And the
got.
Painter of Modern Life.
Oh wait, no. I want the 1846. Where's our 1846? Oh, no. No. Shit. Hold on one second. Oh, here we go. Page 300. We want his Salon of 1846, so before the Revolution. So Baudelaire is a poet who is also an art critic and a literary critic. And I should also say he is one of the first people outside of Germany to appreciate Wagner's work and write about it. Okay, so I think that we've talked about this, but I just want to use this to emphasize the point. Bourgeoisie, bourgeois means urban. Bourgeoisie means the town folk. It means the city dwellers. So it doesn't mean the capitalist class. So it's urban society, town dwellers, city folk, and then capitalism divides the bourgeoisie between the capitalists and the workers. So that's important because the workers are bourgeois, meaning they're an urban class, they're not a country class. The country classes are the peasants, the lords, and the parish priests, and also the traditional artisans like the guild craft artisans in the village. So the bourgeoisie are about a whole new group of people who are not part of that rural caste system in the village and the manorial estates. And so there are the modern third estate, the modern commoners, the bourgeois commoners, as opposed to the country commoners. And capitalism divides bourgeois society between the capitalists and the workers. And in some ways, the capitalists are workers, meaning in a way the merchants are not. So merchants are not workers, but capitalists are kind of workers, meaning they're inventors, entrepreneurs, they create new kinds of production. And proletariat, those without property, the other side of that meaning of that term. So they're the people who breed, but they're also the people without property. Well, workers have their property. What does that mean? It means they have their labor. They have their labor as a commodity that they can sell to employers. So they have their property. They have their own blood, sweat, and tears, their own labor power is their property. That when you enter into a labor contract, you are selling your property for money, and your property is your work. So what does it mean for the workers to become proletarianized? It means that they're expropriated of their property, meaning their labor is alienated in capital. So the inalienable rights of labor are alienated in capital. Also, the means of production. You've heard this language of the means of production. The workers own their tools before the Industrial Revolution. And not only own their labor power to sell, they own their tools. The Industrial Revolution means that the tools, the means of production, become the property of capitalists in a way that was not the case before the Industrial Revolution. Now, again, capitalism, Marxism, the Industrial Revolution, why this is so important, is that before the Industrial Revolution, socialism would be neither possible nor necessary nor desirable. You wouldn't want socialism before the Industrial Revolution. Why? Because you wouldn't have had the Industrial Revolution. So what's great about the Industrial Revolution is that it allows us to transcend the society of labor. It allows us to transcend the social relations of labor. It unleashes new possibilities of what Marx called the general social intellect, science and technology, that social rights don't have to be based on the rights of labor anymore. So we can transcend bourgeois society. That's what communism represents. But in order to do that, first the workers have to take power in order to transcend labor as the basis for society. So only the workers can abolish labor as a social principle. If they don't, then you get this crazy situation where the only way you can exist in this society is through the rights of your labor, but industrial production is working at odds with the social rights of people. Because if you're not a contributing, productive member of society, then what are you? Do you know National Review? It's a journal in the United States. It's an old journal. It's the old journal of the New Right, the Reaganite New Right, established by William F. Buckley. Is that right? William F. Buckley Jr. And then now it's kind of much more just conservative. So they wrote a review of J.D. Vance's book Hillbilly Elegy, an appreciative review in 2016. And they said J.D. Vance does a really good job of showing how white poor people are completely useless to society, and it would be better off if they all died of drug overdoses, because the only thing that they can do now is vote for Donald Trump. Yes. In other words, they're not contributing anything to the society, but they can vote for Trump and fuck everything up. That was the old Republican Party that was trying to resist Trump, of course. Okay. So there's your lumpen proletariat. There's your proletariat. All they're good for is breeding, and they're just breeding people who will be meth addicts and who will vote for Donald Trump. And we can only hope that they die quickly so they can't elect people like Donald Trump too much. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And then J.D. Vance was like freaked out by this because he's like, wait, I thought I was talking about how like you can prevail against poverty, but then it's like people were like, oh, look, ideology is great because it shows how fucked up the working class is. And he's like, yeah, that's not exactly what I meant. And then he became a Trumpist. And Donald Trump, who says that he stands for the right to life and the dignity of work. The right to life and the dignity of work. Bourgeois. Those are bourgeois values. Bourgeois values. Okay, where was I going? Baudelaire, bourgeoisie. To the bourgeoisie, you are the majority in number and intelligence, therefore you are the force, which is justice. Bourgeoisie are the majority. They're the majority. It means it's the workers. The majority of the people of Paris, bourgeoisie. You are the majority in number and intelligence, therefore you are the force, which is justice. Right, this is not the way we use the term today, but it is the term of Marx's time. Some are scholars, others are owners. A glorious day will come when the scholars and the owners scholars. Then your power will be complete, and no man will protest against it. Okay, so suddenly he went from number and intelligence to owners and scholars. Okay, let's see where he goes with it. Until that supreme harmony is achieved, it is just that those who are but owners should aspire to become scholars, for knowledge is no less of an enjoyment than ownership. The government of the city is in your hands, and that is just, for you are the force. But you must also be capable of feeling beauty, for as not one of you today can do without power, so not one of you has the right to do without poetry. You can live 3 days without bread, without poetry, never. And those of you who say the contrary are mistaken, they are out of their minds. The aristocrats of thought, the distributors of praise and blame, the monopolists of the things of the mind, have told you that you have no right to feel and to enjoy. They are Pharisees. For you have in your hands the government of a city whose public is the public of the universe. And it is necessary that you should be worthy of that task. Enjoyment is a science, and the exercise of the five senses calls for a particular initiation which only comes about through goodwill and need. Very well, you need art. What is this, by the way? This is the preface to his critical essay on the National Painting Exhibition, the Salon of 1846. So the government organized painting exhibition, which is a popular event, by the way. So tens of thousands of people go. The newspapers cover it because they didn't have film. They didn't have film. So what was the visual culture? Painting. And what is the popular visual culture? The National Art Exhibition. And people from around the world travel to Paris for the salons, but definitely the people of Paris all go. They all go to the Louvre. By the way, did you know that they stole the jewels? The jewels of Napoleon III. Napoleon III. Napoleon III. This morning I was like, oh, this is serendipitous, right? And then fucking Macron, right? So who is Macron, by the way? He's the Bonapartist party. His party is the Bonapartist party. They're the Gaullist party. And Gaullism is Bonapartist, for sure. And he said this is an affront to like the French national heritage. And you would think that he was talking about the Ancien regime, but he was not. He was talking about Second
Didn't
Empire.
they just like break through the window?
They did whatever.
Yeah.
You know, it was fine.
not
It was like, you know,
12.
criminals and it was some master thievery, like they'll get caught, I'm sure. Right. But it was Napoleon III, and that's the precious national heritage.
That's funny. They kept saying they took Napoleon's jewels
No,
without
but
anything.
it's not. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not. Yeah, and I was
They
like,
took Louis
this is
Napoleon.
too. And like, and listening to this morning, so I'm like, this is so perfect for our class, right? Because you know, the Ancien regime is not the modern French state. It's not, and the modern French state is Bonapartist. It comes out of the Second Empire. That's where it all comes from. So yeah, it's perfectly appropriate, but that's the precious national heritage. Okay, so anyway, back to it. Art is an infinitely precious good, a draught both refreshing and cheering, which restores the stomach and the mind to the natural equilibrium of the ideal. You understand its function, you gentlemen of the bourgeoisie, whether lawgivers or businessmen. When the 7th or 8th hour strikes and you bend your tired head towards the embers of your hearth, and the cushions of your armchair, that is the time when a keener desire and a more active reverie would refresh you after your daily labors. But the monopolists have decided to keep the forbidden fruit of knowledge from you, because knowledge is their counter in their shop, and they are infinitely jealous of it. If they had merely denied you the power to create works of art, or to understand the processes by which they are created, they would have asserted a truth at which you could not take offense, because public business and trade take up 3/4 of your day. And as for your leisure hours, they should be used for enjoyment and pleasure. But the monopolists have forbidden you even to enjoy. because you do not understand the technique of the arts, and as you do those of law and business. And yet it is just that if 2/3 of your time are devoted to knowledge, then the remaining third should be occupied by feeling. And it is by feeling alone that art is to be understood, and it is in this way that the equilibrium of your soul's forces will be established. Truth, for all its multiplicity, is not two-faced. And just as in your politics you have increased both rights and benefits, so in the arts you have set up a greater and more abundant communion. You, the bourgeois, be you king, lawgiver, or businessman, have founded collections, museums, and galleries. Some of you, which 16 years ago, some of those, which 16 years ago were only open to the monopolists, have thrown wide their doors to the multitude. So he's talking about the 1830 revolution. This is still the July monarchy in 1846. You have combined together, you have formed companies and raised loans in order to realize the idea of the future in all its varied forms, political, industrial, and aristocratic. Political, industrial, and artistic. In no noble enterprise have you left the initiative to the protesting and suffering minority, which anyway is the natural enemy of art. The Republican faction. For to allow oneself to be outstripped in art and in politics is to commit suicide, and for a majority to commit suicide is impossible. But we'll see about that. And what you have done for France, you have done for other countries too. The Spanish Museum is there to increase the volume of general ideas that you ought to possess about art, for you know perfectly well that just as a national museum is a kind of communion by whose gentle influence men's hearts are softened and their wills unbent, so a foreign museum is an international communion where two peoples, observing and studying one another more at their ease, can penetrate one another's mind and fraternize without discussion. You are the natural friends of the arts, because you are some of you rich men and others scholars. When you have given to society your knowledge, your industry, your labor, and your money, you claim back your payment and enjoyments of the body, the reason and the imagination. If you recover the amount of enjoyments which is needed to establish the equilibrium of all parts of your being, then you are happy, satisfied, and well disposed. As society will be satisfied, happy, and well disposed when it has found its general and absolute equilibrium. And so it is to you, the bourgeois, that this book is naturally dedicated, for any book which is not addressed to the majority in number and intelligence is a stupid book. Okay. Now there's a lot more here, but we don't have time to go through all of it. So he brings up essentially modernity in the sense of new feelings, new values, new pleasures, new enjoyments, new psychology. Right, so he's reacting against what he calls the dogma of the studios. So that would be academicism in art, which is basically institutionalized romanticism. And he's saying it's not true to the new life that people are living. He describes that life as, again, in comparison to the 1700s. The 1700s is colorful. The 1900s is black. It's drab. Everybody's wearing black. He says society has become a huge funeral procession. Everybody is wearing the egalitarian colors, black, because they're all united in this mourning. Okay, so what are we mourning? The end of bourgeois society and capitalism. Let's see. So artists can be more or less fitted to understand modern beauty. The life of our city is rich in poetic and marvelous subjects. We are enveloped and steeped as though in an atmosphere of the marvelous, but we do not notice it. The nude, that darling of the artists, that necessary element of success, is just as frequent and necessary today as it was in the life of the ancients, in bed, for example, or in the bath, or in the anatomy theater. resources of painting are equally abundant and very varied, but there is a new element, modern beauty. And by the way, it's in response to this directly that Manet does his Olympia painting. If you know Olympia. And so this is maybe the easiest way to demonstrate modernity. So it's a remake of the Venus of Urbino by Titian from the Renaissance. So that's bourgeois art. This is modernity. Right, so the painting of the courtesan is replaced by the painting of the brothel prostitute. Right, and even just the feeling of it, the erotic energy of it is different. Right, so the bourgeois eros is relaxed, languorous. Here it's sort of intense, quick, confrontational. Right, this is a money transaction. This is not. This is more of a traditional relation. And of course, the alternative to either of those is the romanticism, right? So you could sort of dodge the modernity by putting it in some exotic Orientalist harem, right? You could say, oh yes, in the East they still have like sex, whereas we are alienated and fucked up, right? And Monet is like, yes, we are alienated and fucked up. That is our erotic life. Right? And that's Baudelaire. That's Baudelaire. So what did people say about this? The critics say about Manet? They said it's a man in drag because she's not voluptuous. She's too muscular. She's too androgynous. They say that she's a corpse, like the Anatomy Theater. She's a corpse. They say she's a wastrel, which means that she's a low-class prostitute as opposed to a high-class prostitute. So a high-class prostitute would be voluptuous, a low-class prostitute would be a wastrel. She'd be too hungry to stay voluptuous.
Well, if I remember in the Titian, the figures in the back are bending over a marriage chest. So
yes,
it's like the enclosure of the property in this, system as opposed to like the prostitute owning her labor power, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. I mean, this is a nanny and child, right? And this is a brothel servant, right? Staff member, support staff at the brothel. And also, you see the cat? The cat that's like...
And the dog is there relaxed and sleeping.
Versus the sleeping puppy. So in other words, sex used to be like contentment and relaxation, and now it's like starting up in fright.
And loyalty, relationship. The
How do you
dog.
mean?
The
What is
dog,
it?
like a dog's loyal.
Oh, a dog's loyal and cats definitely are not. I'm sorry, I'm a dog person, not a cat person. Cats are sociopaths. Sorry. That's the last thing I'll say about that. No, I just thought of J.D. Vance with the childless cat ladies. He didn't say childless dog ladies. He could have, but he didn't. Right, he just said they were eating cats and dogs. Because he did that too, right? J.D. Vance? Yeah, the Haitian immigrants were eating cats and dogs, and then so he's got those two things, the childless cat ladies and the eating the cats and dogs. So anyway, and there's no animal in this one. There's only the opium. Right? So instead of the curled up dog, you could smoke some opium. That's cool. Right. But you see, modernity. This is the honest modernity, this is the dishonest modernity, and this is the pre-modernity. That's it. So that's why Manet is a modernist painter. Ingres is not. Romantic. And Titian is not. Titian is a classical Renaissance painter. All right. Let's take a short break. Okay. Actually, I lied. We'll do a little bit more Baudelaire. That is the Paris Spleen. In order to clue us in more to modernity. Proletarianization of bourgeois society is the emergence of mass society. So that begins in the 19th century, but seems to be more fully realized in the 20th century. And so the category of the lumpen proletariat and also of the peasants as the sack of potatoes, the homologous magnitudes, that's the term, homologous magnitudes, meaning if everyone's in the same position, it kind of unites them as a class, but it doesn't really unite them as a class. So that's the emergence of the mass. So mass society is in some ways the opposite of class society. So the class struggle, as Marx saw in the 1830s and 40s, seems to yield to mass society in the Second Empire, and again in the 20th century. After the crisis of World War I and the revolutions that followed, it seemed like the class struggle was replaced by mass society and mass culture. So it's the liquidation of class into the mass. And Bonapartism, because it treats everyone the same, the state can dispense with anyone regardless of socioeconomic status, it's also a function of massification of society. So everyone's in part of the mass. And that this is a kind of a weird, like Bonapartism as a political phenomenon, mass culture and mass society, mass politics is a kind of mockery of democracy, a kind of democratic culture and a democratic society. All right, so let's see. This is more towards the end of Baudelaire's career. This is from 1867, the Paris Spleen. These are aphorisms, prose poems, aphorisms, really aphorisms. And his dedication to his publisher. Let's see what he has to say here. My dear friend, I send you a little work of which no one can say without doing it injustice, that it has neither head nor tail, since on the contrary, everything in it is both head and tail, alternately and reciprocally. I beg you to consider how admirably convenient this combination is for all of us, for you, for me, and for the reader. We can cut wherever we please. I my dreaming, you your manuscript, the reader is reading, for I do not keep the reader's restive mind hanging in suspense on the threads of an interminable and superfluous plot. Take away one vertebra and the two ends of this tortuous fantasy come together again without pain. Chop it into numerous pieces and you will see that each one can get along alone. In the hope that there is enough life in some of these segments to please and to amuse you, I take the liberty of dedicating the whole circlet to you. I have a little confession to make. It was while running through, for the 20th time at least, the pages of the famous Gaspard de la Nuit of Aloysius Bertrand. Has not a book known to you, to me, and to a few of our friends the way to be called famous. But the idea came to me of attempting something in the same vein, and of applying to the description of our more abstract modern life the same method he used in depicting the old days so strangely picturesque. Which one of us in his moments of ambition has not dreamed of the miracle of a poetic prose, musical without rhythm and without rhyme, supple enough and rugged enough to adapt itself to the lyrical impulses of the soul, the undulations of reverie, the jibes of conscience? It was above all out of my exploration of huge cities, out of the medley of their innumerable interrelations, that this haunting ideal was born. You yourself, dear friend, have you not tried to translate in a song the Glacier's strident cry and to express in lyric prose all the dismal suggestions this cry sends up through the fog of the streets to the highest garrets? To tell the truth, however, I am afraid that my envy has not been propitious. From the very beginning, I perceived that I was not only far from my mysterious and brilliant model, but was indeed doing something, and if it can be called something, singularly different, an accident, which anyone else would glory in, no doubt, but which can only deeply humiliate a mind convinced that the greatest honor for a poet is to succeed in doing exactly what he has set out to do. All right, so that's a peculiar circumstance of modernity as well, and modernism, which is that the modern writer or artist, or the modernist writer or artist, can't be sure that they've made anything at all, let alone what it is. Right, so unlike either traditional art or even bourgeois classical literature and art, that in this new situation, especially if it's based on the experience, the sensibility of the modern city, can't be sure what you've made, if anything at all. Also, his idea of the serpent being chopped up into segments. So we've dealt with this also in terms of the fragments, but each nonetheless has a life of its own. So, he's got a little bit of an opposite perspective, we'll see, to the Kantian notion of beauty and of art. So if Kant's idea of the beautiful is a sympathetic resonance between subject and object, and also objects are beautiful in a way that sublime spectacles can't be, or charming phenomena cannot be, because beauty is about resolving an object so that it can appear to be autonomous, it can appear to be self-determining, that it sort of makes itself what it is. It's connected to Kant's notion of the teleological being. Let's see what he says here. He's got one determination of this. It says, "Tell me, enigmatical man, whom do you love best, your father, your mother, your sister, or your brother? I have neither father, nor mother, nor sister, nor brother." This is like a call and response of dialogue. "Your friends?" Now you use a word whose meaning I have never known. "Your country? I do not know in what latitude it lies. Beauty? I could indeed love her, goddess and immortal. Gold? I hate it as you hate God. Then what do you love, extraordinary stranger? I love the clouds that pass up there, the wonderful clouds." Meaning, clouds are not really objects. They are passing, fleeting phenomena that you can project whatever you imagine upon them. And so there is an objectlessness. Right? There's no love object. There's no art object. Artist's confiteor, the artist's confessor. That's what that means. How poignant the late afternoons of autumn, how poignant to the verge of pain, for there are certain delicious sensations which are no less intense for being vague, and there is no sharper point than that of infinity. What bliss to plunge the eyes into the immensity of sky and sea, solitude, silence, incomparable chastity of the blue, a tiny sail shivering on the horizon, imitating by its littleness and loneliness my irremediable existence, monotonous melody of the waves, all these things think through me, or I through them, for in the grandeur of reverie the ego is quickly lost. I say they think, but musically and picturesquely, without quibblings, without syllogisms, without deductions. These thoughts, whether they come from me or spring from things, soon, at all events, grow too intense. Energy and voluptuousness creates uneasiness and actual pain. My nerves are strung to such a pitch that they can no longer give out anything but shrill and painful vibrations. And now the profound depth of the sky dismays me, its purity irritates me. The insensibility of the sea, the immutability of the whole spectacle revolt me. Ah, must one eternally suffer or else eternally flee beauty? Nature, pitiless sorceress, ever victorious rival, do let me be. Stop tempting my desires and my pride. The study of beauty is a duel. in which the artist shrieks with terror before being overcome. So, sublimity, or the sublime in Kant, is precisely the threshold experience of not being overwhelmed, let's say. Feeling like you could be overwhelmed, but you're not overwhelmed. It's something that could terrify you, but no, it doesn't terrify you. You regard it as fearful rather than terrifying. So here, no, it's about being overwhelmed in terror, and not the sympathetic resonance of subject and object, but a dual, an antagonism between subject and object. Skip ahead to the end. Just trying to get at things that we had in our selections. Oh, I see. It's got a bunch of fleur de mal at the end. Hold on. Okay. The epilogue. Happy of heart, I climb the hill to contemplate the town in its enormity. Brothel, hospital, prison, purgatory, and hell. Monstrosities flowering like a flower. But you, O Satan, patron of my pain, know I went not to weep for them in vain. But like old lecher to old mistress goes, seeking but rapture, I sought out this trull, immense, whose hellish charm resuscitates. Whether in morning sheets you lie asleep, hidden and heavy with the cold, or flaunt through night in golden spangled veils, infamous city, I adore you. Courtesans and bandits, you are for me such joys, the common herd can never understand. All right, so on the one hand, the common herd offers the joys that they can't themselves understand.
It's really interesting how cloud is regularly addressed by Baudelaire, and I immediately thought about Baudelaire, French art historian, who wrote Theory of Cloud.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
and this book introduces history of painting as a medium from Renaissance till modernism, like seeing that this idea of cloud is basically the essence of painting, yeah, and like in modernist all isms, yeah, cubism, fauvism, etc., like the idea of paints nature, yeah, essence was perceived. Yeah, cloud as a metaphor for both the medium and
The medium.
modernity.
The medium, right. So it traces the history of art through the depiction of clouds.
No.
Or the idea of it.
He reviews the relations between linear perspective and how space is depicted, showing how it becomes less and less rigorous and more illusionary, cloudy, foggy. And that's why he calls it this theory of cloud.
Right. The 19th century is the crisis. We looked at it a little bit with the Manet. That's what Greenberg talks about in terms of flatness. Right? And then Cézanne is the big innovator in terms of like modeling. Right? And that leads into Cubism, etc. Right? Okay. Let's look at this last bit about beauty. Again, the opposite of the Kantian notion, which Baudelaire was acquainted with, of course. I am as lovely as a dream in stone. My breast, on which each finds his death in turn, inspires the poet with a love as lone as everlasting clay and as taciturn. Swan white of heart, a sphinx no mortal knows. My throne is in the heavens, azure deep. I hate all movement that disturbs my pose. I smile not ever, neither do I weep. Before my monumental attitudes taken from the proudest plastic arts, my poets pray in austere, studious moods. For I to fold enchantment round their hearts have pools of light where beauty flames and dies, the placid mirrors of my luminous eyes. again, a kind of terrifying mirror is what beauty becomes. It's sort of a sympathetic resonance between subject and object. And the kind of form giving, the taciturn clay, like becomes the point, rather than whatever form it actually takes. Richard Howard. The Richard Howard translation is okay. Not my favorite. It's good, but not as good. This is a different edition of, yeah, that's the different edition of the book, sorry. Oh, maybe. Oh, that's the same one. That's not great. Okay, sorry. I guess we're not going to be able to look at it. To the reader, the dedication, the first poem of The Flowers of Evil about boredom.
I love that.
Yes. Let's see if they. Oh yeah, they did.
Yeah.
This is a good one. All right, this is not bad. Okay, this is good. Folly, error, sin, avarice occupy our minds and labor our bodies, and we feed our pleasant remorse as beggars nourish their vermin. Our sins are obstinate, our repentance faint. We exact a high price for our confessions, and we gaily return to the miry path, believing that base tears wash away all our stains. On the pillow of evil Satan, Trismegistus, I don't know what that means, incessantly lulls our enchanted minds, and the noble metal of our will is wholly vaporized by this wise alchemist. The devil holds the strings which move us, in repugnant things we discover charms. Every day we descend a step further toward hell, without horror through gloom that stinks. Like a penniless rake who with kisses and bites tortures the breast of an old prostitute, we steal as we pass by a clandestine pleasure that squeeze very hard like a dried up orange. Let's say the version that I had on campus is better. It is. It's much better. Serried swarming like a million maggots, a legion of demons carouses in our brains, and when we breathe death, that unseen river descends into our lungs with muffled wails. If rape, poison, daggers, arson have not yet embroidered with their pleasing designs the banal canvas of our pitiable lives, it is because our souls have not enough boldness. But among the jackals, panthers, and bitch hounds, the apes, the scorpions, the vultures, the serpents, the yelping, howling, growling, crawling monsters, in the filthy menagerie of our vices, there is one more ugly, more wicked, more filthy. Although he makes neither great gestures nor great cries, he would willingly make up the earth a shambles and in a yawn swallow the world. He is ennui, boredom. His eye watery as though with tears, he dreams of scaffolds where as he smokes his hookah pipe. You know him, reader, that refined monster, hypocrite reader, my fellow, my brother. This is actually the translation here. Roy Campbell, that's the better translation. Okay. So the greatest vice of all is boredom, and yet maybe, why is this the dedication poem to the reader? Because maybe people are only reading poetry out of boredom.
From Bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Right. So he, according to Benjamin, and this is something that we'll also take up next week with the Vincent Motifs and Baudelaire. This will be more central to that essay than to this essay. he has a deeply ambivalent relationship to his reader, to his public, to the reading public. In the drafts of a preface to the Fleur de Mal, to the Flowers of Evil, he says, he has an indelible phrase, I do not write for your wives, daughters, or sisters, right? No. Why? Why did he say that? Because in fact, those were the people who bought literature as women, right? So he's just like, fuck, I have to write for women? No, I'm not writing for women. Yeah, no. Hell no. And he's also obsessed with Georges Sand, who's like a major writer of the time, and he
Betrayed for lesbianism.
right. Well, he probably liked the lesbianism, right?
Well,
So
that's what that means.
Yeah, he likes the lesbianism because lesbians are cool because they don't need men, and all prostitutes are secretly lesbian, meaning that they're very expert at getting men off because they don't care about men at all. Oh, this is the world. This is the world.
Question about like Baudelaire's imagery, like in
Mhm.
this and a lot of the other poetry from Fleur de Mal that you assigned, it's like it makes it sound like Paris is like this shit den, just like awful, miserable, and then you like look at pictures of like the actual arcades, and you're like, that looks kind of nice. Like
The arcades, sure.
or like the bullet, like Haussmann's Paris, like all the
That's
things.
later.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a little bit later. Yeah, that's a little bit later.
Like
That's
some
what.
for-
That's what replaced the old streets. Right, so the arcades are 1830s. They're from that boom era. And then they're sort of left behind, right? So then they're kind of decrepit. And although they still call shopping malls arcades. So if you go to Paris now, like I stayed in the area the last time I was there, that was the sort of boulevard nice area, and they had the Lafayette Mall or whatever, the Lafayette Arcades, right? But it was all extremely high-end shops, right? But it was the arcades, but no, it was a shopping mall. Right.
So, is an arcade just like multiple pavilions kind of in one building?
No, it's a covered street.
Okay.
It's a covered street. So basically, the arcades it's the narrow streets of medieval Paris, and then they're built into them as like, basically, it's like it would have been an open air market, but instead it's covered. Right? So it's kind of shops and stores that, where the whole point of it is the mixture of public and private space. Right, so whereas the agora, the market, would just be the market. But of course, in bourgeois society, it isn't that ancient agora anymore. It isn't that public space because each shop is its own private space. And yet the arcades is a kind of blending of like each sort of private shop with this more public space. And it's covered. That's important for him because it's this kind of twilight reality where on the one hand it's got glass covered roofs over the street. On the other hand, because of climate conditions, they tend to have a lot of condensation on them, right? And so it's kind of darker than would be ideal, but it is covered, which means that it's not like on the street anymore, right? So it's kind of, I think that we have a Daumier painting at the Art Institute, The Print Collector. Do you know that one? The Print Collector? It's like a great painting by Daumier. Which shows a kind of, it doesn't show much, yeah, but it shows the kind of the lighting environment. Show the painting?
It's suspenseful.
Yeah, it's sort of, so where you'd have, like, again, sometimes the sunlight would come through, but it would just be at an angle, it wouldn't be, so it's neither outdoor nor indoor. That's the point. and it's private and public space. And it's really the emergence. I should also say something about private and public space that would also be something that we ought not to naturalize, which is, it used to be that people lived above their shops, right? So workers, like artisan workers, would sell their wares in the shop. They'd have the workshop behind the public-facing shop, and then they'd live above it, right? And so in capitalism, however, part of separating the means of production from the working class means that living space and workspace become separated. And also, like, basically production and consumption become separated, so that the shopping space is also not where the thing is produced. Right, so both on the consumption end and on the production end, public and private spaces are separated. Right, so production and consumption are separated, and public and private spaces are separated in a new and different way. That you know, what Benjamin's trying to do is sort of take up how Marx starts Das Kapital. So chapter 1 of Das Kapital says, societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevail present themselves as an immense collection of commodities. Right? And therefore, to analyze the society, we have to start with its single unit, the commodity. Right? And we'll, eventually we'll talk about the later part of chapter 1 of volume 1 of Das Kapital, section 4 on the fetishism of commodities, because Benjamin is pulling some language from that. The phantasmagoria is the word that he takes from that part of chapter 1. Now, the 3 sections of this essay, the Bohème, the Flaneur, and modernity. So he starts off with Bohemia, and then he moves to the Flaneur, and then he has modernity. So the structure of this is basically the 2 ingredients that are combined and transcended in modernity. So modernity is taking up Bohemianism and it's taking up Flaneurism, but it's transforming them. And so Baudelaire is going beyond the old Bohemia and also beyond the Flaneur. So the Baudelairian dandy is not a Flaneur. So why is the Baudelairian dandy not a Flaneur? Because the Flaneur regards the city as a spectacle, and by contrast, the Baudelairian dandy is the man of the crowd, meaning he's immersed in the crowd, he's not regarding it from a distance as a spectacle. Right, so the big figures for his discussion are Victor Hugo and Baudelaire. So Victor Hugo is more of a Flaneur figure, and Baudelaire has, by contrast, this idea of the dandy. Now, the dandy is both borrowed from the British usage of the term, but it's also given a new meaning by Baudelaire. And what's the other weird word that we encounter here? The Apache. The Apache, which means literally the Apache, like Native American, like a warrior, right? So the idea, this goes to the 19th century proletarianized capitalist era, which is, I mentioned the social question of the proletariat. So what are poor people referred to as? The dangerous classes. The dangerous classes. So the idea is that you go to Paris and you're going to find the Apaches there. Now, part of this has to do with the popular literature of the time is Westerns. Right, so it's all about cowboys and Indians. So it's all about like the romance of being out on the plain, and under every cactus is a like Apache warrior about to jump you. And so the idea is that, well, Paris is like that. Like being in Paris is like being in the Wild West, right? And except you're going to be jumped by Apaches, no, you're going to be jumped by the proletariat, right? So physiognomies are these funny little books that people have. It's like a popular book, and so people carry them around. So they're very small, and they basically allow you to read someone's personality off their facial features. So basically, when you're dealing with strangers, which is what the modern city is about. So the modern city, again, because people are having to commute to work, right? So you're encountering strangers in a way that would not have been the case before. So when people lived in huge cities before, they still stayed in their neighborhoods. People didn't encounter as a normal, everyday occurrence, did not encounter strangers, people who they don't know and they're not going to know. So we have the poem To the Passerby, that we'll talk about next week, right? The erotics of that, in other words, what it means to have an erotic feeling about someone that you don't know and that you will never know. And that's a completely new situation for people. Completely new situation for people. But again, we naturalize, but it's totally new. So, yeah, the Apaches and the Apache warrior, the Native American warrior, is the model for the dandy. Because the Native American warrior paints his body, and so it turns his body into an artwork, but the artwork is also a weapon. Because the painting of the body is meant to dazzle your enemies so you can defeat them in battle. So beauty is a weapon, right? And the dandy is not a flaneur, because the flaneur is just sort of regarding everything else, looking kind of voyeuristically at everything, whereas the dandy is themselves participating in the spectacle. And so the way they dress is like their armor and their weaponry in terms of how they're navigating society. And it's all about like illusion and deception and cunning, right? It's all about this kind of appearance that is connected to like combat, basically. And also the artist, that this comes out of Romanticism, but he's taking it up in a new way in modernism. That already in Romanticism there was this idea of like, well, we can't really be artists the way people still could from the Renaissance up through the 18th century. So now we make artworks about the impossibility of making artworks that just sort of suggest the possibility of art, but really one lives one's life as if it were an artwork, right? Like one turns oneself into the artwork. So it's not the things you make, it's you yourself as the artwork. We're going to see, and then Baudelaire takes this up and sort of accentuates it, and we'll see how this informs surrealism later. Because a lot of surrealism is just Baudelaireanism. Like they take their direct inspiration from Baudelaire. So the Baudelairian dandy, living one's life as an artwork, art is a weapon, and oneself is turned into an aesthetic object that is like a kind of doing combat with the world. All of that. So the old Bohemian, the old flaneur, taken up and transformed into the Baudelairean dandy. So the dangerous classes, you don't know who you're talking to, so you need to refer to the physiognomy. What we're dealing with here, what's their personality? The racialization of the working class, which appears to be a recrudescence of an old idea, but is actually a new idea. So we talked about this with Proust, that the aristocracy is racially distinct from the working class and from the peasantry, because the workers and the peasants are Celtic, they're Gauls, and the aristocracy are Germans, they're Franks. So of course that was meant to be overcome in the Revolution. So the big pamphlet of the French Revolution is What is the Third Estate, by the Abbé Sieyès, where he says he's a priest, but he's coming over to the Third Estate from the First Estate. He says the Third Estate was nothing under the old system. It wants to be something, but it shall be everything. And he says if the priests and the aristocrats can't hack it, can't subordinate themselves to society, and also the priests pray, the aristocrats fight, the third estate works. Okay. So it's a society based on labor, 1789. And he says if the aristocrats don't want to fulfill like a social function as employees of the people, then they can go back to their Franconian forests in Germany. Because they're not really part of the people. Right. So the revolution was supposed to overcome that kind of caste division, but then a new division emerges in the 19th century. And the rationalization for the proletariat is that they are biologically inferior. That they're racially inferior, biologically inferior, so you get kind of biological racism emerging in the 19th century in a new and different way. And certainly in a way that betrays the bourgeois revolution. So the idea that it's inherent in people to be as they are, and that the reason that you have the mass of urban poor people is because they are racially inferior. That's within France. In other words, like we would think of France in the 1800s as kind of racially homogeneous pretty much in comparison to say today. But no, class was racialized. Indeed, race is a class thing. It is. That's the point. So that comes with the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of what we assume about like racism is really an industrial era function. Very much an industrial revolution function. So again, for Baudelaire, he is, the strange thing about modernity is how it has to engage this new kind of class reality and this weird warping of what in bourgeois revolution would have understood as the natural aristocracy, the meritocracy. We still hear about this, the meritocracy, meaning you're not assigned at birth a position in society, but you rise as your talents and effort take you. The natural aristocracy, the meritocracy, now gets kind of reified into like a new kind of class division that almost seems to have a caste character. Again, Proust was dealing with that, right? As Jewish and part of the upper class, but not part of the upper class, right? And it's old money, new money, and it's weirdly racialized. Right? Of course, this anti-Semitism also takes on a new value in the 19th century that didn't have previously, because the French Revolution was also the emancipation of the Jews. It was Jewish equality that was established, but then the 19th century brings modern anti-Semitism. Okay, so Baudelaire, and I bring that up, I was circling around to it. Oh yes, because in 1848, Baudelaire, I mentioned Cutrone, his attitude towards 1848. Baudelaire's attitude towards 1848 was very peculiar. First of all, he thought the revolution should kill his stepfather because his stepfather prevented his mother from giving him money. Because he needed money to survive because his poetry wasn't selling as he'd like. So he's like, oh yes, the people are rising up, they'll kill my stepfather, and then I can get my mother's money. And then he said that the revolution and the course of the revolution and what had happened, when the national workshops are canceled, I mentioned that it's because they can't raise money as an international loan. It's the City of London, it's the Rothschilds. And so people are like, the Jews did it. The Jews prevented us from having this public works project. Yes. And so Baudelaire's response to that was, it would be a fine thing to organize a conspiracy for the extermination of the Jews. Yeah. So you see Baudelaire and Marx, doppelgangers, socialism and fascism. Right, so, yeah. So, again, modernism, we've been talking about this. The big thing in the 20th century that Benjamin is faced with is socialist realism versus modernism. Modernism is denounced. It's decadent. It's aristocratic. It's individualistic. It's antisocial. It's degenerate. It's fascistic. Like Mussolini likes modernist art. The futurists are fascists. Right? And Benjamin's like, well, yeah, you're right about that, but no, you're not right about that. Not exactly. Meaning, you have to understand these things together. So I mentioned Baudelaire and Victor Hugo. So Victor Hugo, Les Miserables. That is good from the Stalinist standpoint. That's good literature. It's social realism. It's like prostitute with the heart of gold, the guy who's the victim of the system. Right? It's all the tropes of like the people are good, the ruling class is bad, the state is bad. Right? So basically, for most Marxists of Benjamin's time, Hugo's good, Baudelaire's bad. It's as simple as that. That's the center of this essay. What is the relationship between Hugo and Baudelaire? Because there is a relationship. In other words, they are twin phenomena. But it's not as the socialist realists are presenting it. And Hugo is the flaneur. Hugo is the flaneur. In other words, for Hugo, the people are a spectacle. They're kind of a romantic kind of image. They aren't the reality that Baudelaire was immersed in as the man of the crowd. Right? That's the dandy as the man of the crowd. So he thinks that Baudelaire is truer to expressing the realities of capitalism than Hugo is. Hugo is kind of sentimental, kind of romanticizing the reality of capitalism, whereas Baudelaire is dealing directly with its reality. Right? That the inhumanity of capitalism is what Baudelaire is translating through his work. Right? Again, what's great about prostitutes, they're inhuman. Right? They turn sex into a pure cash transaction. Right? He's like, that is awesome. No sentimentality, just sex for cash. Perfect. Right? But the Stalinists are like, oh no, this is so like dehumanizing. It's like, no, this is reality. This is reality.
You want to touch on like the heroic nature of modernity? I mean,
That's what's heroic. That is what's heroic.
the labor power in our
What he says about Baudelaire is, here it is the commodity itself that speaks. Here it is the commodity itself that speaks. Right, but it's a certain kind of commodity. Meaning, here it's the, objectified, reified, alienated labor power that's congealed with the commodity. Here it is the commodity itself that speaks. So not the commodity as a social mediation between people, but the thing. The thing. Right, so the fact that the prostitute entirely commodifies her sexuality, that is like what Baudelaire thinks is awesome. Right, so it's the thing. It's not the person. It's the thing. Right, so that's where modernism comes in, where, again, it's commodity relations, but taking on a life of their own, such that their inhumanity is what comes forward, as opposed to their humanity. So Baudelaire is giving voice to that in a way that Victor Hugo is still trying to humanize the proletariat. Whereas for Benjamin, no, it's the dehumanization of the proletariat that makes it revolutionary. And Baudelaire's in touch with that. Truer
the
to
heroic element. That's the heroic.
That's the heroic, well, that's the new heroism. In other words, it's not the bourgeois heroism anymore. It's not the ancient heroism, certainly, but it's also not the bourgeois heroism. It's not the humanistic heroism of bourgeois art and literature.
Just to make sure that I understand, the thing that's being valorized about the dehumanization is he saying like that the proletariat get their revolutionary potential by like their dehumanization in this society?
Yeah.
Okay.
In other words, if the proletariat is the product of capitalism, is the pure product of capitalism, and what makes the proletariat revolutionary is that it is the pure product of capitalism, then the danger is that by romanticizing the proletariat, you turn the proletariat back into a bourgeois subject and you lose what's revolutionary about capitalism.
They're kind of like not wanting to abolish the proletariat, but
Right.
to like, okay,
Re-bourgeoisify it,
Mhm.
right? Because again, this contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production, it's not that the industrial forces of production are in and of themselves emancipatory, no, but they do represent the revolutionary force that's bursting through bourgeois society. The danger being that what capitalism does is that it's constantly putting society back together. It's constantly restoring the bourgeois social relations out of the crisis of capitalism. So the industrial forces are constantly destroying capitalism, and then capitalism reconstituting itself by restoring the bourgeois social relations, and then you begin the cycle over and over again. So this was the first cycle. Of course, there were many cycles, but a major cycle is the 20th century Great Depression. And the question is, what's going to come out of that? Because that's when he's writing the Great Depression. What's going to come out of the Great Depression? So far, what has come out of the Great Depression is fascism, not communism. In the same way that what came out of the first cycle was Bonapartism, not communism. Right? And Baudelaire is the voice of that phenomenon. Right? So Baudelaire is not, he's very skeptical about socialism and communism, of course, because he sees it as Baudelaire, because he writes about this, because he knows Proudhon, he knows other socialists. He thinks that it's kind of bourgeois sentimentalism. He thinks it's like, oh yeah, that's the old revolution, but no, we're in a totally new situation now. Right? Because the socialists do take up the banner of the French Revolution. They do take up liberty, equality, fraternity. The Second Industrial Revolution, the Second International, the Socialist International, was founded in 1889 on the centenary of the French Revolution, because the attitude was, we are the inheritors of the French Revolution. We are picking up the revolution that the bourgeoisie abandoned in capitalism when they became decadent. Benjamin is saying, but what is that decadence? What does it amount to? Like, what is the truth of it? What is the point of it? Meaning, of course, Victor Hugo is totally a romantic revolutionary. He's on the side of the people. But where does that lead? It leads to Louis Bonaparte. Now, did you guys know that in the first Trump campaign in 2016, they played the Broadway Les Mis, and you hear the people singing at his rallies? Yes, Trump invoked Les Miserables, of course. Can you hear the people singing Les Mis? Of course that's Trump. Of course it is. Okay, so again, Benjamin's like, you think Baudelaire's a fascist? Well, think about that a little bit more. Think about that a little bit more. Like, yeah, he is. But isn't there more to it than that? Isn't it more interesting than Hugo, who's going to give you this kind of deceptive, kind of romantic humanity of the working class and the prostitutes and right? Whereas Baudelaire is like, no, they're inhuman. They're Apaches. They're lesbians. Right? They're just these like demonic creatures, and that's what's awesome about them. So Baudelaire admires that. Right? Doesn't denounce it. It grooves on it. Right? And so, but again, this is what the Stalinists are kind of papering over with socialist realism. Right? So recall what Benjamin's mission is. Be the greatest literary critic of his time, which meant being the greatest Marxist literary critic of his time. challenging the prevailing Marxism. That's exactly what he's doing. He's saying, this is not really true to Marx. We've talked about the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, right? So the challenge is, how do you do an immanent dialectical critique of Baudelaire? Right? Rather than, oh, that's bourgeois decadence, we don't have to think about that. It's just aestheticism. It's just antisocial, formalist individualism. Or it's just antisocial, which clearly it is. And yet, also Baudelaire is the exemplar, if not the model. Remember, exemplary but not a model? Baudelaire is the exemplar, meaning Baudelaire is the future. But the world is only going to become more Baudelairean. It's also going to remain Victor Hugo, though. So you know when Les Mis was written, the musical? Yeah, it comes out of the 70s depression. It comes out of the crisis that led into neoliberalism. Totally. It's total Reaganism. Like Les Mis is total Reaganism.
I was rewatching American Psycho, you know, the big Les Mis poster.
Uh-huh. Oh, sure, right.
Yeah, that's
right. That's 90s though, right?
Yeah, but it's like a lampooning of the 80s.
Right, right. Okay, we will come back to this next week as well as doing on some motifs in Baudelaire. I needed to get us going, you know, so we could like do. So we'll come back to especially the notes. We'll do more direct treatment of the essay as well as get on some motifs. So the motifs in Baudelaire is shorter essay. Like I said, we have sort of less reading for the second and third weeks of the Baudelaire to help us carry through the thoughts. All right.
Who's doing the commentary?
Ah, very good. I didn't take volunteers. I'm sorry, because we got such an awkward
I
start to
can do it again.
You would like?
Yeah.
Any others?
I think
Baudelaire,
Rex
Baudelaire,
wanted to,
Baudelaire.
I think Rex wanted to.
Rex,
but
okay.
I don't know if she wants to anymore.
Right, we'll see if she's in the hallway.
Okay.
Yeah, whether we're conscripting her or not. I could write to her maybe. The psychoanalytic dimension will be added, and the Proustian dimension will be added in the next piece.
Both of them were obsessed with their moms.
Baudelaire and
Yeah,
Proust.
and Proust.
Well, Proust and Baudelaire are kind of, similar. And Proust wrote about Baudelaire too, so we'll see. Okay, thanks guys.